Hi everyone, and welcome back to Flying Monk Talk Show. I'm Alex, and today we are talking with Nick Hurst, who's kindly come to spend some time and discuss the Shaolin tradition. And Nick is the author of this book called Sugong, The Life of a Shaolin Grandmaster, and it's published by Sports Books. And this book discusses Nick's time with his teacher, who's a Grandmaster of Shaolin Kung Fu. And thanks for coming, Nick, today.
Thank you.
And let's start just, can you explain for everyone who Sugong was? Obviously there's a big book that explains his whole life story, but who was he for you? What was his name, and something about his background?
So I knew about him because I do Kung Fu in London with Master Lai, who's head of the Nampai Chuan school. So that was how I started that, getting on towards 20 years ago. And there was a picture of Sugong that's in the room, so I always knew of him because he was Master Quek's teacher. So I was aware of him for a long time before I actually ended up meeting him, but I took a sabbatical from my work, and that's how I actually ended up going over to Malaysia to find out more about him, because Master Lai comes from Malaysia, so he had learnt there from Sugong, who's actually come from China via Singapore to finally end up in Kuala Lumpur. So what appealed, I was going there just to take a sabbatical, and I wanted to do something a bit different that had a kind of a personal appeal to me, which was Kung Fu.
And when was that, Nick?
That was in 2006, so it's getting on a while now. So I wanted to do something that would have just while I was kind of working out my career options, do something that's personally valuable to me. And there was no idea of writing the book at the time, but because he had this incredible life, I kept on hearing these kind of snippets of story, and there was two things that appealed. One was the fact that it was an incredible story going back to kind of growing up in poverty in a village in China, to then kind of seeking his fortune or an escape from poverty, at least in Singapore, to then meeting up with his master, who's kind of has another strand in the book, who was this temple monk who was from China as well, but was in Singapore, and then moving to Malaysia with a kind of a whole new set of adventures then. So I was fascinated by his life just on its own, but then secondly the history of my school of martial arts as well. And somehow or other I ended up writing a book about it, which hadn't been in the plan.
I see. And how did he feel when you tentatively kind of approached him that you wanted to write something about his life? I
was quite lucky in the fact that I wasn't anywhere close to him at the time, so I'd come back here temporarily. Okay. I think he was delighted. He was delighted because I think recognition's always going to. If someone tells you that you think their life's worthy of a book, I suppose anyone would be quite pleased with that. Course, yeah. So he definitely loved the theory of it. When we actually started doing the interviews and the reality of it kicked in, he took a slightly different view to it, because he had quite the old school mentality towards things, which was essentially that he would tell you what he wants to tell you, and you should be grateful for it. Whereas if you're trying to get enough information to write a book about someone's life, they don't always fit in together.
I see. I'm very interested in people's memories from 50 or 60 years ago. How much of it, did you hear stories that kind of changed a little bit along the way as well?
Yes, and I think there's two reasons for that. I think he actually had a fantastic memory. I'm sure there are times where, because there's been such an expanse of time, that he wasn't totally clear on things, but I think a lot of the time he definitely remembered incredible details. He could tell you this little thing happened there, and it's like, I couldn't even remember that kind of thing from a week ago. But it would change, and that the other side of it was because everyone crafts their own life story to some extent, even to the point that people, the way people use Facebook and whatever, to kind of put an
present
impression
an
out.
Image and so on.
Now, if you're presenting an image on Facebook that's going to last, a day on a post, and you're willing to do that, if you're having a book written about you, you definitely want to make sure. So I think there was definitely a bias towards his side of the story, as there would be. In the same way as if you're writing an autobiography, I think.
But he still comes across as having been involved in some pretty, let's say, shady stuff in Malaysia.
Yes.
He was kind of fighting against Triad gangsters and also at times seeming to work with them. It's a little bit murky.
Yes, and it's. I think in the book it probably comes across slightly as a grey area, and I think that's probably because it was to some extent a grey area. In those times, and so the other thing is I didn't want to judge it at all, because in those times where he grew up, where he was living, it wasn't quite a thing of I'll lead a good life, or I'll be, you're in these rough areas. People who you've grown up with, who you've been friends with since you were younger, are going into kind of things that and that's the way they need to survive. Going into slightly shady areas, you can get drawn into them. He was never. I know that he was never a triad. He never kind of initiated into the triads or anything like that. But he definitely knew triads, and potential. And there were occasions where I know that he was defending people against them, and his reputation, he could use that against them. There's other times where he would be working in terms of security and things like that. Now, how much good versus bad and all these kind of things, it's impossible to tell.
Because there's another side of it, is the Tong Clans.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was in Malaysia, it's very clear, you can still see the Tong buildings. They weren't exactly criminal fraternities, but they would protect people. Sometimes they'd have to use force or arms, but their function was essentially to protect families and groups of people. So once again, if it was in a modern context, we'd think of it as something a bit sinister, but back then it was just functional, because there wasn't law and order as we know it.
That's it, and I think it was actually both, and it depends which ones you're with. And so there's always, whenever you're on a kind of a borderline area, you can get ones that are on the right side of that line and ones that are on the wrong side of that line. And I think his Sugong was definitely, his view was that he'd been always trying to end up on the right side of the line, but he'd been walking that line without a doubt.
So how about morality? What was his? He seems as someone to have very strong morality in his own unique way. How would you describe his morality?
His whole thing would always be righteousness. You know, and that's what his ideal would be. But I think on the way towards that ideal, there'd be temptations on the side. So he'd be trying for that righteous path. I don't think he hit it all the time.
I see, sure.
And I think he'd admit it some of the time. Maybe some of the time he wouldn't. But that's what he was trying to do. But that's another thing as well. People, it's almost like there's a higher standard set for martial artists sometimes, and people almost expecting. I mean, that's one of the things that really stood out to me when I was over there. This kind of idealised thing of a guy with a little wispy beard sitting and kind of dispensing wisdom isn't the reality. These are just normal guys, and especially the ones that have been in that, growing up in past rougher times. They're pretty kind of pragmatic about life, but it doesn't mean they're kind of, you shouldn't kind of judge them too harshly, because they're not kind of going along with our unrealistic expectations.
Sure. I think this whole image of someone floating in the clouds and never doing anything, never doing anything wrong is it's very maybe rare or impossible.
And it's our kind of escapist fantasy.
It's like Tibet, that we think Tibet is this amazing Shambhala kingdom, and it was ruled by living Buddhas, but there was a lot of shady stuff in Tibet.
Right.
That's not often talked about. So things like that I think it's our projection of what we wish things would be. When I went to Hong Kong first time, I was 16, and I had this image that everybody would be like speaking like David Carradine in Kwai Chang Caine, and they'd all have white beards, and they'd be very that. And the first master I met, he was in a gambling den.
Right.
He was drinking whiskey, smoking, and spitting into a bucket next to him.
Yeah.
And asking me for money. Right. That was my very first introduction to a kung fu master in Hong Kong.
And I imagine you met a few more that are quite similar to that.
Yeah,
as well.
and some who were really lovely and complete opposite. But even the ones that had all these habits weren't necessarily, they were bad people. They were just like shattered the image of this pure monk-like person that I was looking for.
Yeah.